Welcome everyone to today's webinar. We're really happy that you're here. I'm Jenny Garman, the library's civic engagement specialist, and it's been a real honor to get to work with the League of Women Voters to bring this ballot measure presentation to you all. We started at the end of September with in-person meetings, first at our central library, then at Plaza, then at Blueford, and wrapping up at Northeast with our partners RevEd-KC. You'll notice this presentation is being recorded, and we're asking you to use the Q&A option for any questions that you have. We will get to that at the end of the program. You'll see in this presentation that the League members have really done their homework, lots of sources and footnotes, and I'll be sharing with you in a follow-up email the recording of this webinar and a list of resources that includes this slide deck with some really great short videos on all of the amendments and all of the cited sources. Thanks also to the League for dropping off this great voter guide. You can pick your copy up at your local library. And since I want to share with you right now that the link for the resource list. So it's going to be right here in the chat for you to find. Just so if you were interested, you want to go see where all these sources were coming from, you've got that right there. And also, since you are interested in being an informed voter, by the end of this program, I will have included an invitation for you to join me next Friday. It'll be Media Literacy Week, and I'll get to work with community partners, including the League of Women Voters, on a Vote Ready program, Friday, the 28th at noon. And so, but today is this Friday, the 21st. Let's get started with our program.
All right. Thanks, Jenny. Good morning. Welcome to our ballot measure information session, a collaboration of the Kansas City Public Library and the League of Women Voters of Kansas City. I'm Greg Woodhams, the League's Voter Education Chair, and I'm joined here by my teammates Melanie Bussey, Jim Edson, and Melody Messner. I want to thank the Kansas City Public Library for its partnership in this event. This November, you will have statewide ballot measures on your ballot. Our program today will first inform you of how the ballot measure process works in Missouri. After that, our focus will turn to the November ballot measures. We give special attention to the measures dealing with marijuana, the Kansas City Police, a Missouri Constitutional Convention. As the League of Women Voters, we have made an effort to adhere to a standard of non-bias and nonpartisanship in our presentation. Our goal is to present to you, the voter, with the information necessary to make an informed decision. We also provide information based on an understanding of the views of proponents and opponents. We will not be presenting any position of the League of Women Voters regarding any measure. Jenny will be assisting us with the question and answers session, which will be at the end of the program. And those questions can be administered through the question and answer part. So thank you for your attendance, and thank you for you taking the time to become an informed voter. And now to begin on the first slide of our presentation, I'd like to introduce Melanie Bussey.
Thank you, Greg. I'm going to ask if Jenny can go back on the slides. There we go. Thank you. In the upcoming general election in November, voters will be selecting their U.S. and Missouri state senators and representatives. In addition, voters will face 5 separate ballot measures, which, if passed, will amend the Missouri Constitution. Not all citizens can independently change their state constitutions. In fact, Missouri is only one of 26 states where citizens can independently change their state constitution. Our current constitution was written in 1945 and has been amended 119 times. So why is this process important to us as voters? We all want a say in our government. Many believe it is our right and our duty to actively participate in our democracy. We want our voices heard. Ballot measures give Missouri voters the opportunity and power to directly decide on matters that affect their daily lives. because whether ballot measures come from the legislature or through a citizen's initiative, the final decision on the measure is reserved specifically to the voters. There are three ways the Missouri Constitution can be changed. First, citizens can attempt to change the Constitution by submitting an initiative petition. Secondly, the legislature can propose a constitutional amendment. And finally, a constitutional convention can be convened. Voters will see all three types of proposals on the ballot in November. A quick summary of each type of proposal is as follows, and a more detailed explanation will be offered later in the presentation. An initiative petition can be started by a citizen or an organization. If a sufficient number of signatures is gathered, the proposed amendment is placed on the statewide ballot for voter approval. Proposed Amendment 3, a marijuana ballot measure, is an example of a citizen's initiative petition that will be on the November ballot. The Missouri legislature can put a constitutional amendment on the ballot by passing legislation with a simple majority vote in both the House and the Senate. Unlike a citizen's initiative, signatures are not required. Proposed Amendment 4 regarding the Kansas City police measure is an example of a legislatively proposed amendment that will be on the November ballot. Pursuant to the current Missouri Constitution, voters must be asked every 20 years if a state constitutional convention should be called. If a convention is called, delegates propose changes to the Constitution that are later put before the voters for approval. All the proposed amendments on the ballot in November, regardless of their path, must be approved by you, the voters, by simple majority vote. Missouri citizens from different political parties have used citizen initiative petitions for more than 100 years. Former Republican Governor John Ashcroft sums up the purpose behind the initiatives by stating, "It is through the initiative process that those who have no influence with elected representatives may take their cause directly to the people." The Hancock Amendment is an example of a citizen initiative amendment advanced by conservatives. The Hancock Amendment, approved by Missouri citizens in 1980, limits the role of government in the lives of its citizens. The amendment specifically limits the government's ability to tax and spend, and it prohibits the legislature from passing unfunded mandates to local governments. The unfunded mandate prohibition is relevant to the Kansas City police measure, Amendment 4. So what is an unfunded mandate? An unfunded mandate happens when the legislature requires that a local government spend money on a program, but fails to provide funding for that program. The Medicaid expansion amendment from 2020 is an example of a citizen initiative petition advanced by progressives. They wanted Missouri to opt into a provision under the Federal Affordable Care Act to expand health care coverage to those whose income was below the federal poverty level. Coverage was to include infants, children, and pregnant women, as well as blind and disabled adults. The legislature was opposed to the opt-in provision. The amendment in favor of expanding coverage was approved by 53% of voters. Legislatures opposed to the expansion argued that the amendment was unconstitutional because it created an unfunded mandate that is prohibited by the Hancock Amendment. The Missouri Supreme Court ruled that the amendment was constitutional because it was substantially funded by federal funds. Let's talk about how a citizen initiative petition like Amendment 3, the marijuana proposal makes it to the ballot. Remember, there are two main paths for a constitutional amendment to get on the ballot. The citizens, independent of the legislature, can propose a constitutional amendment by submitting an initiative petition. The petition must be certified by the Secretary of State, and the proposed constitutional amendment must be approved by voters. Tonight, for clarity, we'll call this a citizen initiative petition. The legislature can also propose a constitutional amendment. Their proposed amendment must be approved by a majority vote of the legislature, certified by the Secretary of State, and then must be approved by the voters. How can you get a constitutional amendment on the ballot? Has anyone here been asked to sign a petition before you go to the grocery store? I know I have. There are four main steps to a citizen initiative getting on the ballot. Step 1, a citizen or an organization starts the process by submitting an initiative petition to the Secretary of State's office. The Secretary of State's office approves the petition form and prepares official ballot summary language. The state auditor prepares a fiscal note summary. Then the Secretary of State certifies the official ballot title, which consists of the ballot and fiscal note summaries. The official ballot title must follow the single subject rule and use fair ballot language. What is the single subject rule? The Missouri Constitution restricts ballot measures to one subject and one article of the Constitution. For example, each of the ballot measures before the voters this November deal with only one subject. The marijuana amendment could not have included a proposal on sports betting. Fair ballot language is defined by Missouri law. To be fair, the language has to be a true and impartial statement of the effect of a yes or a no vote, not intentionally argumentative, not likely to bias the voter for or against the proposed measure, and state whether the measure will increase, decrease, or have no impact on taxes. Fair ballot language does not come from the proponents, the legislature, or the League of Women Voters. It comes from the Secretary of State. Here is the fair ballot language for this November's Marijuana Initiative Amendment 3. A yes vote will amend the Missouri Constitution to remove state prohibitions on the purchase, possession, consumption, use, delivery, manufacture, and sale of marijuana for personal use for adults over the age of 21. The amendment would also allow individuals with certain marijuana-related offenses to petition for release from prison or parole and probation and have their records expunged, along with imposing a 6% tax on the retail price of recreational marijuana. A no vote will not amend the Missouri Constitution, and the sale and use of marijuana for recreational purposes will remain prohibited under current law. Medical marijuana would remain unchanged. If passed, this measure will impose a 6% tax on the retail price of recreational marijuana. Once the petition has been approved by the Secretary of State, the second step is to gather signatures. Current law requires getting an amount of signatures equal to 8% of the legal voters in 6 of the 8 congressional districts. The third step is to submit the signed petition to the Secretary of State no later than 6 months before the election. In our marijuana initiative example, the deadline was May 8th. On May 8th, the sponsors delivered a petition to the Secretary of State with a total of 385,000 signatures. The fourth step is for the Secretary of State and local election authorities to verify signatures. Local election authorities verified that signatures on petitions matched the signatures on voter registrations on file. On the last Tuesday of July, the Secretary of State announces the findings of the verification effort. The petitioner is notified if the Secretary determines if an insufficient number of signatures has been submitted. Any citizen can appeal that finding, with resolution of that appeal required within 10 days. If the Secretary of State determines that a sufficient number of valid signatures has been submitted, the petition is certified and placed on the ballot. Here's an example of how step 4 played out in the marijuana initiative. Enough signatures were determined to be valid in the St. Louis and Kansas City districts. However, in Congressional District 6, 46,000 signatures were submitted and only 31,000 signatures were needed. The first count by election workers resulted in the petition numbers being short by 1,131 signatures. Upon appeal, a second count indicated that the required number of valid signatures was met. Once on the ballot, a simple majority of votes is needed for passage. It isn't easy getting a citizen initiative before the voters. Between 2010 and 2020, less than 4% of the ballot initiatives that were filed by citizens were certified by the Secretary of State's office. However, once certified, the odds of passage improved. In the last 50 years, 66% of the certified ballot initiatives were approved. For example, this year, a ranked choice voting initiative petition failed to get the required number of signatures, while the marijuana initiative was certified only on appeal. While the initiative process has been used to advance both conservative and progressive laws, recently there have been attempts to restrict it. This past spring, I'm going to check something. I want to go back. Sorry. I apologize for that. While the initiative process has been used to advance both conservative and progressive laws, recently there have been attempts to restrict it. This past spring, the Missouri House passed Joint Resolution 79 that would have made the citizen initiative process more difficult. The resolution did not pass the Senate, but it is likely to be proposed again in 2023. If it had passed, the resolution would have made it harder for constitutional amendments proposed by citizens to become law. How? Well, here's what the resolution would have done. It would have increased the number of signatures required to get a measure on the ballot. Currently, it's 8% of voters. The resolution would have required 10%. It would also have increased the number of congressional districts from which signatures must be obtained. Now signatures must be gathered from 6 of 8 districts. The resolution would have required all 8 districts. It would have increased the amount of voter approval needed for a measure to become law. Now, only 50% of voters must vote in favor of a measure for it to become law. Under the resolution, a supermajority of voters, or 66%, would have to vote in favor of the measure. But that 66 requirement would only apply to constitutional amendments proposed by citizens. Amendments proposed by the legislature would still require 50% of voter approval to pass. What are some of the reasons why people want to make the process more difficult? Those in favor of making the process more difficult say that the current threshold is too low, that it is used to advance legislation that the legislature opposes, and that interests from outside of Missouri have used the initiative process. What about the people who are against making the initiative process more difficult? What is their position? They say that the citizen initiative process has served different parties over the years. Increased requirements would make the effort nearly impossible for most groups to achieve. And as a result, the voice and will of the people in a democracy would be silenced. It is easier for the legislature to advance constitutional amendments. Missouri is not alone in seeing attempts to restrict the citizen initiative. 26 states have seen laws advanced to restrict the initiatives. Most recently, a proposal by the South Dakota legislature to restrict the initiative process was rejected by voters. I'm now going to turn the presentation over to Jim Edson to talk about the marijuana initiative.
Sorry about that. Some of you may remember in 2018, Missouri voters approved a citizen-initiated constitutional amendment regarding medical marijuana and veteran health care services. That constitutional amendment legalized marijuana for medical purposes. It set a tax on marijuana sales at 4% and allocated those tax revenues to healthcare services for veterans. The amendment passed with more than 65% of the vote. This November, Amendment 3, a citizen-initiated constitutional amendment, seeks to remove bans on marijuana sales, consumption, and manufacturing for adults over 21 years old in the state of Missouri. If approved, it would legalize marijuana for recreational use by those 21 and older and create a regulated marijuana industry. The ballot measure would take effect December 8th, 2022. Missouri would become the 20th state to legalize recreational marijuana. If approved, it would also permanently remove from public record any conviction for any nonviolent marijuana-related offense and allow persons with certain marijuana-related nonviolent offenses to petition for release from incarceration or parole. Here's the official ballot title. Do you want to amend the Missouri Constitution to remove state prohibitions on purchasing, consuming, using, delivering, manufacturing, and selling marijuana for personal use for adults over the age of 21, require a registration card for personal cultivation within prescribed limits? Do you want to amend the Missouri Constitution to allow persons with certain marijuana-related nonviolent offenses to petition for release from incarceration or parole and probation and have records expunged? When we say a record is expunged, we mean that the record of a conviction is deleted from public record. Continuing with the ballot title, do you want to amend the Missouri Constitution to establish a lottery selection process to award licenses and certificates, issue equally distributed licenses to each congressional district, and impose a 6% tax on the retail price of marijuana to benefit various programs? Here's the fiscal note. State governmental entities estimate initial costs of this amendment of $3.1 million, initial revenues of at least $7.9 million, annual costs of $5.5 million, and annual revenues of at least $40.8 million. Local governments are estimated to have annual costs of at least $35,000 and annual revenues of at least $13.8 million. So what do the proponents say? The public wants to have a safe and legal market. The public wants decriminalization of recreational marijuana-related activities and expungement of criminal records for past marijuana offenses is long overdue. Opponents say the amendment limits the number of licenses to commercialize marijuana. This would restrict new businesses from participating in the industry and give an unfair advantage to companies that currently commercialize marijuana today. Civil penalties that allow fines up to $100 for smoking marijuana in public would become part of the Missouri's Constitution and would continue to be a burden on law enforcement. And they say that passage would have negative health consequences. So I'm going to turn it over to Greg now to talk about Amendment 4.
Thank you, Jim. Now let's turn to amendments that come from the legislature. A proposed constitutional amendment from the legislature has a much easier path to the ballot than a citizen initiative petition. This is because it does not require the cost of gathering signatures on a petition. In the case of this year's marijuana initiative, the petition drive costs exceeded $5 million. A constitutional amendment proposed by the legislature follows a track similar to that of legislation. First, it must be proposed by a legislator, and then it must pass by majority vote in both the House and the Senate. After that, its path is similar to a citizen-initiated constitutional amendment. From the past legislation, the Secretary of State crafts and certifies the official ballot title, which consists of the ballot summary language and the fiscal note summary. It is also subject to the single subject rule and fair ballot language requirements. Like a citizen initiative petition, the proposed amendment requires the approval of the voters. Once on the ballot, it also requires a simple majority of votes for passage. Now, let's focus on Amendment 4, the Kansas City Police Spending Amendment. Amendment 4 is a constitutional amendment proposed by the legislature regarding Kansas City police spending. It reached the ballot after approval by the majority of the Missouri House and Senate. There are two questions here. First, why does the Missouri legislature want Missouri voters to pass a constitutional amendment that affects only the Kansas City Police Department? And the second question is, why does the legislature need voter approval of a constitutional amendment to increase state-mandated spending for the police force? To understand this, we need context, and we need to look at three things. One would be history, two would be recent events, and the third would be the Missouri Constitution's prohibition of unfunded mandates. So first, history shows us that the state took local control away from Kansas City in 1939 because of corruption related to organized crime. Currently, Kansas City is the only city in Missouri and the largest city in the United States that does not have locally elected control of its police force. Instead, the Kansas City police force is controlled by a 5-person board of police commissioners made up of 4 Kansas City residents appointed by the governor. The 5th member is the mayor of Kansas City. Missouri law currently requires that Kansas City spend at least 20% of its revenue on the police force. The city currently operates above that threshold at about 24%. Oversight of the police budget, including decisions on equipment purchases, hiring of new police officers, and police salaries, is controlled by the Board of Police Commissioners, not the Kansas City Council. So now let's go to point number 2. Let's talk about recent events. In May of 2021, the Kansas City Council voted to reallocate part of the police budget to create a separate budget for crime prevention and community policing. The council wanted to negotiate with the police board how the new crime prevention funds would be spent. After allocating those funds, the remaining funds for the proposed police budget was approximately 20%, down from the prior 24%. Here's a graph to explain. Up and down, you have the percentage of general revenues. The bar on the left is the initial 2021-2022 budget to the police board. On the right, you will see where the Kansas City Council sought to reduce the budget to the police board by $42 million to the 20% state minimum. The $42 million, which is shown in dark blue, was to be put into a separate community policing and crime prevention budget to be negotiated by the city and the police board. The police board objected to City Council's proposal and in June of 2021 sued the city, arguing that Missouri law gave the police board the exclusive right to manage the police. The court agreed with the police board. The action taken by the City Council prompted members of the state legislature to introduce legislation that would require Kansas City to spend more than the current funding requirement of 20% of its revenue on the police budget. Two laws were introduced during the 2022 legislative session. One was Senate Bill 678 that it would increase the percentage Kansas City allocates to police force spending from 20% to 25%. However, the legislature did not provide Kansas City with money to fund the mandated increased spending. And that brings us to point 3. Remember that the Missouri Constitution, through the Hancock Amendment, prohibits unfunded mandates. And remember what Melanie was talking about earlier. An unfunded mandate happens when the legislature requires that a local government spend money on a program but fails to provide funding for that program. So a companion bill, which created Amendment 4, was also passed by the legislature. It seeks to create a specific exception to the Missouri Constitution to mandate the increased spending without providing funds for the Kansas City Police Commission through Senate Bill 678. In other words, Senate Bill 678 cannot be enforced without the passage of Amendment 4 because it is an unfunded mandate. And let's use a graph to illustrate this. Up and down, we have the amount budgeted in millions of dollars. Each column represents a different budget. The light blue area is the state mandated amount at 20%. The dark areas in the bars are amounts over that minimum. On the far left, we have the current minimum spending mandated by the state, about $193 million. In the middle, Kansas City's 2022-2023 current budget of $234 million, which is about $41 million over the $193 million minimum. And at the far right, the proposed amount by the legislature, which is $241 million at 25%. That is $49 million more than the current state minimum and more than the current Kansas City budget. Now that you understand the history, the recent events, and the importance of the Missouri Constitution's prohibition of unfunded mandates, we're ready to begin talking about Amendment 4. Here is the official ballot title and fiscal note. Shall the Missouri Constitution be amended to authorize laws passed before December 31st, 2026 that increase minimum funding for a police force established by a state board of police commissioners to ensure such police force has additional resources to serve its communities. State and local governmental entities estimate no additional costs or savings related to this proposal. The fair ballot language is as follows. A yes vote will amend the Missouri Constitution to allow the General Assembly by law to increase the minimum funding for a police force established by the State Board of Police Commissioners and to ensure such police force has additional resources to serve its communities. Currently, the only police force established by the State Board of Police Commissioners is found in Kansas City, Missouri. A no vote will not amend the Missouri Constitution regarding the funding for a police force established by the State Board of Police Commissioners. If passed, this measure will have no impact on taxes. Proponents believe the amendment and accompanying legislation is necessary to prevent the Kansas City Council from reducing police funding. Proponents also believe the amendment is necessary to ensure that the Kansas City Police Force has the resources to keep Kansas City safe. And finally, proponents also believe that the Kansas City Police Department should not be controlled by City Council, but remain under the control of the Police Board. Opponents believe the citizens of Kansas City should decide how their tax revenue is spent, not the Missouri State Legislature. Opponents also believe that Kansas City should have elected local control over its police force and how crime is fought, both through policing and crime prevention. And finally, opponents believe that the measure could have a negative impact on other city services that could see budget cuts. And now Melody will talk about the Constitutional Convention question.
Thank you, Greg. The question of whether to call a constitutional convention will be on our November ballot. Here's the official question. Shall there be a convention to revise and amend the Constitution? Voters vote yes to support a constitutional convention. Voters vote no to reject a constitutional convention. Before going into the ballot language, let's provide some background. Every 20 years, the Missouri Constitution gives the voters the ability to call a constitutional convention. Since 1962, Missourians have been asked every 20 years to consider convening a constitutional convention. The voters have rejected the question every time. Voter approval by a simple majority of votes is needed for passage. If voters approve the ballot measure, the governor will call an election to select 83 delegates. A delegate must possess the same qualifications as a state senator, including being at least 30 years old, a Missouri voter for 3 years, and a resident of their district for at least 1 year. A delegate cannot hold another public office. Here's how delegates to the Constitutional Convention would be chosen. Voters in each of the state's 34 Senate districts would choose 2 delegates in a special election. The 5 political parties, Republican, Democratic, Greens, Libertarian, and Constitution, would each be allowed to nominate 1 candidate for each of the state's 34 Senate districts. The top 2 vote getters in each district go to the convention. This process chooses 68 delegates. There are also 15 delegate positions chosen by voters across the entire state. The 15 candidates with the highest number of votes statewide would be seated. Unlike the district delegates, these delegates are not nominated by a political party, and party affiliation is not noted on the ballot. The Missouri Constitution is not specific on the rules of the convention. There is one requirement that, quote, the sessions of the convention shall be held with open doors. Any proposed changes to the Constitution submitted by the convention must be approved by voters. Remember how we talked about fair ballot language? Here's an example. A yes vote will require the governor to call an election of delegates to serve at a convention for the purpose of revising or amending the Missouri Constitution. Any revisions or amendments will then be put to a vote of the people for their consideration. A no vote would mean no constitutional convention will be held. If passed, this measure will have no impact on taxes. Now, proponents say that a constitutional convention would be an opportunity to eliminate changes to the Constitution made over the last 20 years. And the power of a constitutional convention is beyond the reach of the governor or the legislature. No veto can block its work, and no sanction is needed from lawmakers. Only the approval in a statewide vote can change the Constitution. Opponents say that the current political atmosphere is not right for a convention. A constitutional convention in the middle of a culture war would attract extreme ideologues across the political spectrum. Opponents are also concerned that approval of the question will set off a potentially heated fight financed by special interests to choose convention delegates. There is a proposed constitutional amendment related to municipal bonds and another related to the National Guard on this November's ballot. Both proposed amendments originated in the legislature. They were advanced with bipartisan support and saw minimal opposition. They are not controversial. So in the interest of time, we did not talk about these measures today in order to dedicate time to more controversial proposals. We have, however, presented written summaries of these in the audience notes. So where can you get voter information? Before November 8th, make sure you are ready to vote. You can go to several sites, kceb.org, vote411.org, sos.mo.gov/elections to check your registration status, confirm your address, and check your polling place. Now is also the time to make sure you have the proper ID to present at your polling place. Proper ID is now a non-expired Missouri driver's license, Missouri non-driver license, U.S. passport, or U.S. military ID. Before November 8, get informed about what's on the ballot. Sources for information are vote411.org, the League of Women Voter Forms like this one, League of Women Voter Guides, local media and libraries like the Kansas City Public Library, the local election board, and ballotpedia.org. The Secretary of State's office is another source of election information. You can check your voter registration, register to vote, and inform yourself of elections and ballot measures. When considering a source of information, we think the following standards are important. They should be nonpartisan, they should cite their sources of information, and they should provide information from both proponents and opponents. So let's talk about vote411.org in greater detail. Vote 411 was launched by the League of Women Voters Education Fund as a one-stop shop for election information. All 50 states have vote411.org sites. Vote411.org provides nonpartisan information with both general and state-specific election information. With vote411.org, you can check your voter registration, find out what's on your ballot, find election dates, find your polling place, and compare candidates and study ballot measures. You can also create a copy of your ballot to take to the polls. Now we're going to take questions. Back to you, Greg.
Okay, Jenny, what sort of questions do we have?
We don't have any just yet, but I know some folks came in a little bit later, and I want to just ease your mind. This is being recorded, and I will share this recording and more resources in a follow-up email, probably before the end of the day, but definitely by Monday. But please, if you have any questions, don't be shy, put them in the Q&A section. I don't know if you can see me circling it right down here, but we've had a lot of great questions, I know, during our in-person sessions, and some of those answers are, some of the resources for those answers are actually in the link that I shared right there. That'll take you to a bibliography of sorts, a resource list.
Sure. While we're waiting for the questions to queue up, I'm gonna go ahead and talk about, let's say, the most common questions we've gotten on each of these.
That'd be great.
Certainly with the Kansas City Police Amendment, Amendment 4, there were a lot of questions as to who votes, and the question here is, or the answer here is, everybody in the state of Missouri is voting on this. This is not just Kansas City voters that are going to be voting on it. And let's say a counterpart question on that was, if it succeeds, if the amendment fails in Kansas City, but it passes outside of Kansas City, what happens? And the answer is, well, it would pass. This is all decided by voters statewide. Another question we had on the marijuana initiative related to the mechanics of or just the notion of who is opposing the amendment. And generally, most of the opposition of the amendment was coming from people that were focusing on the commercial dimension, people that wanted to have a much more or less restrictive market and a much more open market, and the proposal is for a regulated market. And then finally, on the Constitutional Convention, the question we had related to the structure of the convention, and again, the Constitution is fairly vague on that, as noted in the presentation. The only thing that is spoken to in the Constitution is that the Constitutional Convention must be conducted with open doors. And then lastly, another question we had on the process of the ballot initiative process, a lot of people had questions related to signatures and how signatures were important. And the punchline on this was, if you are asked to sign a petition, make sure you provide your customary and signature that corresponds to what is probably on file with the election authority. And then the other thing is, make sure you also provide the information on your address. In other words, if you don't sign it well, and you just put your name and you put Kansas City and no address, that's probably a much more vulnerable signature when these signatures are validated than if you put in your complete address and you sign as you sign your voter registration card.
Hey, Greg, we have a couple questions.
Excellent.
How is word getting out to those outside of Kansas City so they are able to vote as an informed citizen? I'm presuming, and just let me know in the chat, this is about Amendment 4, or is this about, I think that's what that's about.
Yeah, so if you recall in our presentation, we talked about the voter guides, we talked about Vote 411. So published information on this is available not only in Kansas City, but all throughout Missouri by the League of Women Voters. In other words, the statewide, the League of Women Voters has efforts, and they do have their voter guides, and Vote 411 it also has a state component. So that's all there in either the League of Women Voters voter guides or Vote 411.
Another question we have is, how can we learn who or which groups support or oppose each amendment beyond this overview? And I would say a lot of that will be in that resource list, because you all have footnoted when you've said opponents say and proponents say. But do you have another answer, Greg?
No, you've hit the nail on the head, Jenny.
Okay.
We were very conscious of making sure that when we talked about what opponents say and what proponents say, that we documented who those proponents and opponents were. So you will find in the footnotes, and the footnotes are there in and in actually Jenny did a great job putting together the bibliography. So that bibliography will take you to all of the different proponents and opponents. Many times what proponents and opponents on anything have to say, a lot of times they said those in some radio interviews. So a lot of those radio interviews serve as really good sources of information.
And I also want to share too, if you missed it when we began, these are available at your local library location. And there's a question on why is there no amendment 2? And I think that's just one of the amendments that we skipped over because it wasn't controversial.
No, that's a good question. There is no amendment 2. That's an excellent question. I think that somehow or another there. Oh, I know why. I think that may have been the ranked choice voting initiative, and that failed to get the sufficient number of signatures. I'm pretty sure that's the answer.
Thanks, Greg. I appreciate that. Another question about graphics at vote411.org. Any way that people can share on social media to their own networks so that people can be informed voters on Amendment 4?
Oh yeah, I think that any of the information that is up, anybody on the internet or any reader, you can always just use your browser and you can share your links. And in fact, any information we have, you have that. We know that our short videos, we have short YouTube videos. Those also, YouTube makes it easy where you can just plain share on that. So there's all of this stuff. It is, in our opinion, it's more valuable the more it's shared. So feel free. We would be very happy if audience members shared any elements of this presentation.
I agree. I appreciate sharing knowledge. And I think there was also a question in the Q&A about are police commissioners paid? And I did just a quick search, and I just want to share that with everybody. It looks like members receive a salary of $2,400 per year and reimbursement for realized and necessary expenses. And I will add that link to the resource list that you all have access to now.
That's a great question, and Jenny, I appreciate you doing the research on that, and you did that so quickly. I'm impressed.
Well, library special powers. That's. Are there any other questions? These have been really great questions. I really appreciate them. No rush. We still have plenty of time.
So while we're waiting for other questions to queue up, let me go to some of the other questions that have come up. There was a lot of questions about the marijuana initiative and why there was so much detail. And one of the important conclusions that was reached was that voters should know that this is a 35-page long petition, and it's very detailed. And the proponents did a lot of work in specifying a lot of dimensions of it. And one of the reasons was that it's very clear that what the proponents were doing is they really wanted to make sure that whatever was accomplished here with this amendment would be beyond the reach of the legislature. So that's one observation. And then that takes us to another question we got from many people, is that, well, in the past, when voters have voted on ballot measures, isn't the doesn't the legislature feel bound to consider the opinion of the voters? And the answer that was given is that when we interviewed an aide to a state legislator, we asked that question, and that aide said, no, the legislature does not necessarily feel bound to follow whatever the voters may say. And then to finally illustrate this, there was an example of what was called a puppy mill amendment. It was a ballot measure. It was advanced as a statute, and it passed. And then because it wasn't a constitutional amendment, all the legislature had to do was to pass a law. And the legislature passed a law that basically undid what was done in the ballot measure. And again, that ballot measure was passed as a statute and not as a constitutional amendment. Statutes are subject to override by the legislature. So those are two additional ones that came up in our Q&A period.
The last thing that surfaced in our Q&A section was thanks for setting this up, that it was very helpful. And I'm grateful to all of you for participating with us here today, and to all the great league members who made this possible. I put in the chat, I hope you can see it, that I hope you'll join me next Friday, same bat channel, so to speak, Friday at noon next Friday, to hear some tips and tricks on how to be an informed voter, and some background on how voter guides have been developed. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. I'm seeing some other questions. It's just comments of what a great program, and anxious to get the link for this presentation to share with others. Very much appreciate that, you guys. I'll get that out to you all as soon as I can. It should be ready to share pretty soon. With that, are there any more comments from any of you before we close out?
I would like to, on behalf of the league, thank all the audience members, and our message is thank you for taking the time to be an informed voter.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you all so very much. Yeah, and I see that there have been a lot of questions about the police information about Amendment 4. I hope that you'll feel more confident answering those questions now that you've heard where it's coming from, and all that great background information too. All right, 3 minutes to 1. Red Friday. Can we say go Chiefs? That's we're gonna say that. I'm gonna say that anyway. And again, thank you all so very much for your time today, for sharing your expertise. And I will get this recording and more information out to you as soon as I possibly can. Thank you all so very much. Have a great weekend.
You too.